Welcome to the next edition of the Beyond the Bubble podcast. And it's a pleasure to have here someone who is spending about 24 hours in Brussels, and we managed to schedule this interview and the conversation. A scholar, an author, a rabbi, a traveler, a speaker, wearing many hats. Levi is originally based in New York, but he's globetrotting because he's written a wonderful book, which is called Letters for Life, Guidance for Emotional Wellness from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And there are some words in that title that probably need a bit of clarification of what those mean, but we will definitely look at not just the form, but the substance, meaning the teachings or the ideas and the very broad and far-reaching ideas that the book has on aiming for getting to emotional wellness and even defining what that actually means. So with that little introduction, Levi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Andras, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Amazing. And you have written a bestseller. Is that your first book?
Yes, it's my first book.
That's a good start. Okay, starting with a bestseller. So you've written this book, but before we look at what's in it and what ideas you have distilled, so how did you get to writing that book? What was the path that led you there?
So I actually never thought I would be a writer and author. It wasn't on my horizons. I was growing up, like everyone, the person of my own, and I started, as my own mind and heart were emerging, I started experiencing, despite the fact that I had a good childhood, good education, good friends, I started feeling the negative thoughts and feelings that I think so many of us have in today's world, the anxiety, the insecurity, the fear, the isolation. And I was searching for something that would talk to that inner world in a way that transcends all the noise and all the quick fixes or the quick clicks that we have around us, and would really talk to the soul in a way that transcends the negativity and allows me a new path. And that's when I found myself gravitating to this extensive body of wisdom of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's letters. Maybe, hopefully, we'll get in a little bit to the historical background of that. But briefly, the Rebbe was a Jewish sage, Hasidic master, and one of the greatest Jewish leaders in modern times. He's mostly known for his work reviving Jewish life after the Holocaust and for his spiritual leadership in the world at large. But I think what's lesser known, or at least I was less in tune with, was his extensive private counseling. So I've been studying some of his teachings, but I've never actually delved into the one-on-one private conversations and letters that he had with so many individuals. So here I was looking for answers for myself, and I find myself gravitating to this 20,000 letters, 33
20,000.
volumes, yes, 33 volumes of letters to individual, person after person. And these letters are addressing the exact feelings that I'm having, 50, 60 years later as a person in this world. So I start reading one letter and another letter and another letter, and the words started coming off the page and kind of becoming alive to me. And I feel like they're mirroring the exact experiences that I'm having. So I started reading more and more, and I started detecting patterns, recurring themes, pillars that the Rebbe clearly sees are critical for building emotional health in a very unsettling world. So I started taking down notes, here's one idea, here's another idea, here's another idea, here's another letter that articulates that idea in a new way. And my notebook started growing. And when I felt that I have a certain comprehensive picture of themes from the Rebbe, I started trying to implement them in my own life. Here's an idea, a new perspective. Here's a new behavioral piece of advice. Here's a new meditation. And every day, day in, day out, I'm working through this notebook and the tools that I'm discovering in these years bygone, but also very present and practical guidance. Mm-hmm. And slowly it started taking me out of that darkness. And sometime in that period is when I thought I should try to put that down in a book for others to gain from as well.
No, I was going to ask you because it's interesting that, so you talk about a religious leader, highly charismatic and someone with an incredible influence across many continents and many communities. So how much is it a religious leader and how much a spiritual leader, or how much just a very deep connoisseur of the human psyche and human nature, and what are the good responses to that?
That's an excellent question, and also a deep question. So maybe we'll just go a step back. We're talking about Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was the seventh leader of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, which dates back to the 1700s as an extension of a Jewish mystical movement of Hasidut. I actually think your question touches on one of the central components of his teachings, which is the idea of unity, that we like to parse things into dichotomies. There's the spiritual realm, there's the practical realm, there's the emotional realm, and we like to kind of separate them and see them and delve into each one on its own. But the way he saw life and the way he taught life was that there's an intertwined reality, our body and our soul, the spiritual and the physical, this world and the higher worlds, they're all interconnected. And I think in his guidance and his counseling, you'll see a morphing together and a interconnectivity between the spiritual side and the religious side, so to speak, and also the pragmatic, everyday, emotional, everyone's experience. So I think that touches on big, deep part of his teachings, your question.
So that's a very interesting angle to all of that, because some people would look at a religious leader and someone with that notoriety and visibility. He passed away 2 or 3 decades ago in 94, I think. But again, his legacy lives on in many ways, where they say, okay, here's I say that in air quotes, a religious leader, but not necessarily understanding that those ideas that you have distilled in those books are far universal. And universal as in it's not limited to the Jewish community or even one part of the Jewish community, but to the human experience, or to our everyday growth and connectedness to these challenges, and what sort of answers do we seek? How do you see that? Absolutely.
Actually, one of the extraordinary things that I've seen since the book's release has been just how many people that are no connection to particularly anything Jewish, totally non-Jewish background, totally secular, just really connecting to these ideas. I always believed that these are universal ideas because the emotional experience is universal. We all have the same fears, the same anxieties, the same insecurities, the same search for real and true joy. But to actually see how that pans out, people from all, I was just in Alaska, and some of the very prominent people in the community there have read the book and were speaking about how that changed their life. There's a state senator in Florida, not from a Jewish background at all, and she was saying, a friend of mine told me they were just happened to be speaking to her, and they were saying, Letters for Life, I have it by my bedside, and I read it every night, and I take so much spiritual energy from it. And I think it talks to your point, that the emotional experience is universal, and the wisdom distilled herein, it draws from the wellspring of Jewish wisdom. But that Jewish wisdom, I think, is accessible to every human being, and addresses our experience we all share.
And just going back for a second, so you mentioned 20,000 letters, and all of those were basically handwritten, as far as I understand. I mean, not necessarily really in ink, but with some typewriter or computer at a point, but personally written to specific letters addressed to him. So even just as a performance, as the output, the scale of it is incredible. But I find a certain parallel with those fairly common genres where people write to a psychologist or therapist or someone who can give them some guidance with very unique problems, but you see the commonalities, right? That are see there are recurring themes. So how did what is the way this all came to be? That people understood that here's someone I can turn to for advice, and chances are I'm going to get a personal and truly personalized answer.
That's an excellent question. I think it was literally by word of mouth. In other words, it was after the Holocaust, and there was a deep void of spiritual leadership. I think the Jewish people, the world at large, but especially the Jewish people, felt that they've lost their brightest and their deepest in the fires of Europe. And people were searching for someone that can recapture the ancient wisdom that we carried through the ages, the Jewish tradition, and encapsulate it for them in a way that addresses the experiences they're having today. And the word started spreading that there is someone who's connected to that tree from Europe, but he's here in New York. And he responds. He actually responds to letters that he receives, and people just started flocking.
He was born in Ukraine, I believe.
Yes.
Right, 1902. Is that it?
Yeah.
So basically, lived through all the cataclysm of the 20th century.
Yes, he was in Russia by the Russian Revolution, and then he actually studied in Berlin in the university. He had to leave in 1933 when the Nazis took over, and he moved to Paris, to the Sorbonne, and he had to run away from the Nazis in Paris as well. Moved to Vichy, and from Vichy he made it to New York in 1941, just before everything closed down.
Yeah, so there were quite some experiences to build that perspective and that wisdom. And the interesting thing, I was very surprised and speaks to the quality and the depth of your book, is that there's an endorsement from Dr. Edith Eger, who had written the mega bestseller and an extremely well-known book, The Choice. She's a Holocaust survivor and a clinical psychologist, and basically the positive psychology of saying, okay, you've gone through incredible adversity, and here is what you can do from it, with it, even coping during it, but then how do you recalibrate your life, because you have a choice, right? And that's the idea. And she gave a very positive review of your book. So how does that come together again? Because here's someone who's a clinical psychologist and really into helping people lead a better life, and then coming together with the very subject of your book. So someone who, like the psychology, so is this book, perhaps I'm going back to my original question, I'm dancing around that theme where, so the psychology, spirituality, religion, and how this gets mixed up, and someone like her would say, this is not a religious book in any sense. This is a book about finding a better life. Is that accurate?
It's a deep question, because I'm reticent to say that there's nothing of faith in here. And I actually also believe that when we strip things from their uniqueness, they lose their power. Then it becomes, everything is saying the same thing, and becomes one big universal stream, but then the particular power of a particular perspective is lost in the mix. So what I'm saying is that I think the end result of choice and choosing positive and going forward is the same, but the particular energy that fuels that over here is uniquely rooted in a very, very deep faith in God, and therefore in mankind, and therefore in our ability to transcend negativity in a very, very deep way. So I would say that the bottom line and the actual where it's pushing might be in a similar direction than a lot of what you might say positive psychology, but I think what it's rooted in and what gives it the real punch is the age-old and deep faith in the transcendent. So if that responds to your question.
Makes me think a lot, because right behind you on the wall there's a tree, and there's for good reason, because what I hear you say also is that you cannot build an edifice without a very deep-rooted faith. And again, we're not talking let's say, verticals. It has to be such a deep-rooted faith in the transcendent. And we'll hear what you say.
Let me interject. I didn't say that you can't build an edifice. I think it's a different type of edifice to say that it builds it in a different type of way.
Right.
But, sorry.
Right. Yeah. No, I get it. But I think for something like for to find our place in this world, I think that requires that connectedness, and I use that word connectedness in the sense of a deep roots and to aim high, need to have that foundation. And yeah, certainly you can build stuff, but it's not necessarily going to last. Or there comes the winds of life and the hardships and challenges that's much more prone to falling and not lasting. So I think that how it all comes together between your very deep-rooted belief in the transcendent, and again, it may not be a religious belief at all, but it is still a belief of yes, there is some goodness and there is some direction towards which I want to head. And I can translate that into writing a book and helping others find their path. And it can translate into an everyday activity, which again has that meaning. So I think that the words meaning and that very deep-rooted belief is what helps us achieve a better place.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what animates, I think, the pages of this book. I think a lot of psychology and the discussion around it today is gripped by a certain hesitation and by a certain, walking on glass, walking on eggshells, because we don't want to say the wrong thing and we don't want to hurt anyone. But I think in a deeper way, there might be a lack of true faith in people. We're not sure that people are able to do better. We're not sure that people can really transcend. Maybe they're broken. Maybe they're truly broken, lost people that don't have any hope. So the best we want to do is we just want to caress them, but we are very reticent often to challenge them and to say, you're much bigger than that, and you can go much further than that, and you can actually transcend your past and transcend whatever is going on in your mind right now to an entirely new frontier. And that's why I was so touched by these letters, and I think so many others are, because there's a confidence. There's a confidence that comes from a real conviction that there is an infinite soul, divine spark or divine energy, whatever words resonate most in a person, that allows them to be, the word I'm looking for is not flexible, but it's fluid. It's fluid. You don't get lost in a space. You can be in one place, but you can move somewhere else entirely. You can walk. And that's an energy that comes from a deep faith. So
I think that's a fundamental part of it, because someone who's in depression, someone who's currently, let's say, in a horrible relationship, someone who's at a stage in their life where they're full of anxiety and a very dark place, it is that trust, and more than trust, even that faith, that deep-rooted belief,
confidence,
that there is a better place I could get to. And I think that's what gets lost, because we can be so locked in a dark place and have our mental outlook be so constrained to say, I even lose the idea, let alone the faith, that I could be happy, that I could be fulfilled in my life, that I could have better relationships, that I could really realize my potential. So how do you see that through these letters? How does it unlock that stuckness? Is that a word?
How does it do it? So I've come to learn and see the power of the written word, that the energy beneath it comes through on the page if the work is done to properly present it. So I think the faith that the Rebbe instilled in these letters to individuals, it could be a young teenager, it could be someone in middle age facing an existential crisis, it could be someone in a rehab center, But there's a faith that he vested in those letters when he was communicating to those people. It springs back alive, and it comes through the pages. I do think it comes out from the pages, and this type of confidence and energy, it's not something, I think anyone who works in media or anyone who works in writing will say that the underlying energy is not something you can necessarily explain rationally, but it's something that someone senses when someone really believes in them. Do you really believe in me or do you not? So I think that comes off the page, is that just that belief.
And I think you said a couple of key words there, because there is this very deeply held conviction, belief that you have that potential. You as the other person, you in distress, you're in a dark place, and here comes someone who says you matter, you can, and you're able to get to a better place. And I trust you, and I trust in you that you're able to get there. And I think it's a powerful thing that someone's able to convey that through the written word, as you said. So there were lots of face-to-face interactions, and people went to meet him at a time. But the very idea that someone who's thousands of kilometers away, or miles for you, so far away, but they get a letter from someone that they trust would be able to help them and changes their life for the better. So you do have that level of charisma here and there, but it's extremely rare.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Actually, I ended the book with something called a concluding essay. And the end of the concluding essay, I include the observation of a journalist who met the Rebbe in the 60s. And she wrote an article in one of the leading papers in Israel. Actually, should I just give it a little read? Because I thought she captured beautifully what we're talking about here. So she wrote, I've sat across the wise, I've sat across the intelligent, I've sat across the artistic, but sitting opposite a true believer is different. Well, after meeting the wise, you remain what you were, no less a fool and no more a sage. After meeting the intelligent, you remain what you were, either knowledgeable or ignorant. After meeting the artist, you remain what you were, right? Be a creative or a handyman. Not so with the believer. After meeting him, you are no longer the same. Though you may have not accepted his faith, you have nevertheless been embraced by it. For the true believer believes in you as well. I just thought it's a very beautiful.
I especially appreciate the last sentence, because I wanted to voice an opinion or view. You say, well, being a true believer is not inherently a positive thing. To say, I truly believe, maybe in the wrong idea. Can very easily happen, and we've seen over the many, especially you take the 20th century, there were a lot of true believers, and a lot of true believers in very destructive ideas. And when you say, or this journalist says in the end, that a true believer believes in you, and I think that's a major distinction, because if I believe in an abstract idea, again, there is a chance it's wrong. There is a chance it's not necessarily amenable to leading a better life or just a more harmonious society or generic well-being. But if I believe in you as an individual, there's a lot of value there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you say? What does that actually mean to believe in another person? When this journalist said that it's a belief, what was the word? Belief in...
The true believer believes in you as well.
Believes in you as well. So when I say I believe in you, what do I believe in?
It can express itself in different ways, but I think the universal point in all types of truly believing, and therefore truly believing in others, is that there's something bigger than the specifics in an individual. There's something bigger than the present. There's something bigger than their faults or even their benefits or what they give you or what they give themselves or how they look. There's something there that's transcendent. I think that's the core of it. And that changes everything. That changes the way you relate to them. That changes the way you believe where they can go. You see them as much bigger. Actually, I'll read two more lines. This one from the Rebbe, from an English letter. He writes, every human being is endowed with immense potential powers. If material things have tremendous atomic powers, right? Everything material we discovered lately we never could have imagined what's in a table, right? So how much more so, how much greater is the atomic power of the soul, which, as the Torah teaches, is truly a part of the divine above. It is only necessary to actualize it. This is a matter of the individual's own will and determination. So, and he's explaining that he says nothing stands in the way of the will. That's what he's coming to explain. He says the sages assure us that nothing stands in the way of the will. So that type of belief that there's what you see in the surface level of a table, but then there's something, atomic. There's something that's just on a whole entirely different level. And the same thing in a human being. That there's what you see, and then there's just that other level of energy. I think that's the essence of it. But that, again, can manifest in many different ways.
Yeah, I would agree. Because I think perhaps we could say a key word here is the potential. And where you are stuck or you're in a dark place, you do have the potential to get a much more fulfilled life. And somebody with a deep belief says, I know it. Mm-hmm. I trust it. Yeah. I'm absolutely convinced that you can get there. And I think it has an extremely strong persuasive power, especially for those who are lost in some sense, perhaps as you were, as a young adult, and says, okay, there is hope for something better. So how do you unlock that potential?
Right. So it's an excellent question. So it's not just that there's hope, although that is the first step. There's a lot that the Rebbe counsels in his letters for how to go about unlocking that and allowing it to animate your day-to-day life in a way that brings you the peace and the joy that we want. It took me 5 years to distill this into 300 pages. I can't really cut it down anymore, to be honest. I can't. There's a lot of wisdom that's hard to just say over here. But one recurring theme is the need to expand our minds. It's in a little bit of a different direction than a lot of what we're hearing today, actually, is to try slowly but in a steady path to get out of the rabbit hole of becoming entangled in our own thoughts and our own feelings and our own past and our own frustrations, and to start identifying as active members of a bigger whole that need to give, that need to contribute to that. And by a practical way of taking 5, 10, 20 minutes a day and think about someone else's life journey. What are they going through, and how's their health, how's their family, how's their financials. And when we do that, no matter what we're feeling, even and especially when we're feeling down and lost, and to the exercise of forgetting about yourself, forget about what you're feeling, and trying to get involved and occupied with something beyond yourself. The simple thing of someone else's life. And allow that to call on you, that you have not only a role to live a good life, but also to a responsibility to give a good life, to contribute, to create. And when we connect to that in an active and conscious way, that is one of the keys to unlocking that potential that we have, to starting entirely again. So it doesn't usually in the Rebbe's teachings go through the pathway of digging, really down the hole, but actually by allowing that energy to liberate itself and expand itself to someone else, to our role in the world, to our purpose here. So that's just one component of many, but yeah.
But it's a very practical one, because contributing to someone else's, I wouldn't say well-being necessarily, just helping out or being a listening friend or anything along those lines already can move a tiny bit that needle and say, I'm useful, I'm helpful, I mean something to them, they mean something to me. So that human connection starts to build, which inevitably has a positive impact on you.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think in the Rebbe's counseling, it's not there is letters where he's emphasizing the confidence that comes with the value that you're useful. But I think in a deeper way, he speaks about our inherent design that we're all supposed to be takers, but also givers. And if you look at the natural world, you'll see actually that everything needs to be nourished. You know, plants need soil and they need sunlight and they need water. But there's also something particular that every being in the natural world, in the ecological system, the animal kingdom, contributes. And that's part of the very way the world and the universe is designed. And us human beings have free choice. So we can sometimes become subsumed and preoccupied with how everything is giving to us, how life is treating us, how our friends are treating us, how our families treating us, how our parents treating us, how our spouse is treating us. How is we're always judging the metric of how much they're giving to us and if they're giving to us in the right way. But we become so entangled with that we forget about our role as a giver. And to forget, to put aside for a few minutes all the taking and how that's going, and even if it needs help, and say, okay, now I'm dedicating this time to my role, to be there for someone else, to be there for my environment, to be there for my neighborhood, to be there for my community. And that is critical for health, not just because it makes us feel useful, but also because that is the very alignment with the way beings in this universe are supposed to be. There's supposed to be reciprocation. There's supposed to be a taking and a giving. And if we misalign with that, there's letters, the Rebbe's communicating this, you're going to naturally feel discomfort because you're not aligning with the way you're supposed to be.
There's a lot there, which I want to zoom in a little bit, because I think this is a topic with a close friend of mine, and we do keep coming back to this very notion where being in sync with how the world works is the guarantee of your well-being. And being out of sync is the direct way of burnout or being overexposed or just deeply frustrated, because you might be giving. You have this altruistic mindset where you only give. You basically sacrifice yourself on the altar of giving to others and nothing else. But then you don't get. Then you don't pay attention to your own needs and getting that nourishment that you talk about. That is not good either. So finding that balance, and you say how the universe is made and is built, or the laws of nature, if you're more, let's say, down-to-earth minded, but there are these dynamics, and I would even say universal truths, which are very hard to find and very hard to translate into your everyday life. But if this is not in sync, you're not going to be in balance and in sync with those forces.
Yeah, actually, it's a letter that I was coming off, which literally uses words like you're saying. I'm saying about this particular theme. There's an interesting line where the Rebbe says I actually found out after the book. It's a longer story. Maybe we'll get to it. After I put this in the book, and I was deeply moved by this letter, I found out the background of this letter, that it was to a student at Harvard who was, very successful, brilliant kid, started experiencing darkness just, like everyone. And to the point he was having so much pain that he admitted himself to the Mental Health Institute of Harvard at the time. This is in the 60s. And from there is where he wrote this deep self-examining and self-autobiographical letter to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe responded to him. He was suicidal, to that point. And part of what the Rebbe wrote is that you should read your letter, and you'll see that even though it's such an articulate letter, you articulated everything about yourself, but there isn't one line in there about how you see and how you are doing in your role as a giver. And then the Rebbe writes a line that I just want to say, talks to what you were saying, is a brief reflection will clearly reveal that the universe we live in is ordered in a system of give and take. And the personal universe of the individual, the microcosm, must likewise conform to the system of reciprocal relationship. But this is the line I was saying. Consequently, one disrupts or distorts the system. It must necessarily bring about a distortion in one's immediate surroundings, and especially in one's inner life, because You're not living in alignment or in sync. I like that word, in sync. It's a very good word with the laws of nature almost. The word it must necessarily. You will naturally, by law of nature, you'll start feeling deep discomfort and pain. It's a much longer story that student from Harvard. Maybe we'll get to it, but just wanted to share that. I love the words you're using because it really aligns. It's in sync with the way the Rebbe writes to this person.
Yeah.
Go ahead, yeah.
No, I think so. Many ideas around that. One is I do sense, maybe I would even say I know that there are many people who would push back and say you can change almost everything, or perhaps not even almost everything, but everything, including maybe you can change the way the weather works. You can turn night into day, symbolically speaking, by living a life where you are using drugs or caffeine or whatever substances, and you can push those limits, and you can change societies by engineering societies in the harshest way. But it's not actually true. There are certain ways how human communities flourish. What are the components of communities living well with good standards of health or good standards of education or employment and all the rest? So what I'm hitting at is that there are certain, may I call laws of nature, may I call the way the world works, may I call it how the universe was built. There are many ways of phrasing it, but there are certain truths which need to be respected. And these are not religious teachings. These are not economics textbooks, and these are often subject to a lot of scrutiny by saying, what are these? What are these perimeters, or what are these crucial points that we need to respect in order to live in harmony with the way the world works
and with ourselves,
right? And
harmony with ourselves. Yeah.
What are the results? So, because if you do it right, the results would show. So, if you look at results and you look at societies or communities, but even individuals who are genuinely kind of in their place, they are in sync with their personality or nature or how they are, and they live a happy and fulfilled life, and the people around them also are generally in a good place. You say, okay, so probably they're doing something right, right? So what are those things that you could distill from those and say, what are these rules so often invisible that we need to be in sync with? And the give and take is one of the many. And again, not too much on giving, not too much only on taking, finding that middle ground and finding that balance, and you'll be in a good place, which is awfully difficult because it requires self-reflection. It requires awareness of what's happening. What am I doing? What am I doing right now? What am I doing broadly in my life? What is my place in my family, in my society? A lot of questions towards yourself to know. So how can I adjust myself to something if I don't even know where I am? Right? Like how can I synchronize myself with those laws or deep rules if I don't even know what I'm doing right now, if I don't have that self-awareness? Like the student you mentioned at Harvard in the 60s who wrote that long letter of how much pain he was in, not realizing that he's out of sync, right? So it's a very difficult exercise to at least aim towards that synchronicity with those often invisible laws.
Yeah, I think that's why, as another law, and maybe one of the invisible laws of nature is that, and it's another one of those laws that people are trying to do away with, I think, and I think it's part of the structure of the universe, is that we have elders and sages and teachers that are more in touch with these laws and First of all, there's someone outside of us, right? A friend can be the same thing. They're objective, but they're able to show us and to put up a mirror to how we're living and to a better way of living that is more aligned and more in harmony. So I agree, when we're just alone, it's very difficult and maybe even impossible. But I think that's why it's so important to turn to sages and teachers and mentors and friends to help us find that alignment.
And I think this becomes a very complex and, let's say, I wouldn't say politically, but socially charged question. Because you could easily say, but there's a lot of conservative thought in that, but the term conservative in the sense of conserving, right? Like of conserving something that proved to work for a very long time. I just give you one, rituals. And I think rituals are such essential part of our lives. And these are absolutely not limited to religious rituals. It could be the ritual of a birthday that, let's say in my family, before any family member has a birthday, who's, let's say my immediate family, we would give the balloons and have the cakes and we go out for a restaurant. It's a little ritual, but it's an orientation point. And there could be millions of other rituals of doing certain habits or certain customs, or you have celebrate Shabbat and all the rest. And I think these are just such important legacy, or this is such an important legacy. And no matter what tradition someone's grown up with, but keeping that certain legacy and not letting that go is what keeps you, that yet another element that keeps you in sync with those things. But the reason I'm saying it can be politically charged, because there are certain rituals which may not be the most positive ones, or that could be no longer viewed as a positive one. And again, comes the judgment, like which one do you keep, which one do you let go? But something you gotta keep, because if you don't have that, something else is gonna fill that place, and it's not necessarily a good one. Right? And that's why so often religion and politics are basically considered as the same in many ways, because you still believe in stuff, just not necessarily the most conducive to a thriving society, a thriving community. So keeping rituals or keeping certain traditions, it has its place, because that's another component in finding that synchronicity.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually want to make 2 points. Again, there's a lot in there, a lot of deep thoughts. So the first point I wanted to address, you're saying that it feels conservative, but I think you were saying we need some conservatism. I actually want to, I don't know, take issue, but make it a little bit different but connected case. And that is, it reminds me of a story that I heard. It's not really a story, but I was visiting an older woman in London a few years back with a friend of mine who was her grandson. And she was telling us about her father. Her father was a Jew deeply immersed in Hasidic teachings, the Hasidic masters. But he, after the Holocaust, started going around and, really finding the lost people of the Jewish people and trying to connect them in various remote places in the world. That's what he used to do. So he ended up being on the road a lot of the year. After her mother, this grandmother, her mother, which was the wife of this person, passed away, he stopped traveling. And she asked him, his daughter, she's telling this to us, she said, Dad, why did you stop traveling? I mean, it's not like when you're traveling, you're home. It's not like you were home, right? So what's the difference, so to speak? And he said, when my wife was alive, I was able to travel because I had a home to come back to. So the fact that I had a home to come back to, I had a wife, a spouse that loved me to come back to, that's what allowed me to go to the furthest corners of the world. But because today I don't have a home to come back to, I don't even have it in me to go outward. And, what I think to me that illustrates is in the human experience, the same thing is to innovate and to progress and to go forward in the right way. We need to have a home to come back to. And if we don't have the home to come back to that anchors us, we actually don't progress. So I don't think it's like we need to stay in the old ways. I think having that anchor that from which we emerge, from which we explore, from which we innovate is what allows us to travel and to progress and to go forward. So that's just perspective on that, is that it's not in conflict. Actually, I think the only thing that truly allows us to move ahead, because once we lose that home and we're just in the wild, you can be moving backwards very fast, and you're not finding the courage or the faith or the reason, the optimism to explore forward. And the second point, do you?
No, I have a connected idea to that, but I'll let you go ahead.
The second point is in a little bit of a different note connected to what you said, that something will fill its place, which I think is very deep insight, and it reminds me of a video that I saw from Rabbi Steinsaltz. Have you heard of Rabbi Steinsaltz?
No.
One of the greatest scholars he translated single-handedly the entire Talmud into modern Hebrew and English, which is a phenomenal feat. And he was just, the time called him, one of scholar in a millennium. He was a brilliant person, passed a few years ago. And I saw a video of him coming to Yale. And he was in conversation with the dean of the Yale Law School. After the Yale Law School is, one of the most important intellectual institutions in the world. And there was, a whole host of the deepest intellectuals and professors of philosophy and students in the audience. And he had a sharp, Rabbi Steinsaltz was sharp in his communication. And what he said he said, you guys think, not you, he didn't say like you guys, he said, people think that today we liberated ourselves from religion, we progressed beyond that, and, today we don't serve anything. Today we're just independent, we're rational. So there's not at all. It used to be the pagans had a god of sex, a god of power, a god of money, and then monotheism was introduced and we started serving a transcendent God that unites the world. You guys just went backwards. You threw away that transcendence and you went back to serving sex and power and money, because a person services something. And if you take away the higher united divine, we lose our pants to the lower instincts, and that's not something new. That's something that the whole world used to be that way. They used to make rituals and cults around, all these low instincts. There was cults around going to the bathroom, and we have a higher energy in us that searches for the transcendent, and if we don't feed it with something that's truly transcendent, it will express itself with all types of losing ourselves to very lowly places. So I just thought that, coming off your point, that something will take its place, I thought he brought out with such power, is that you just went back to the old pagan gods. You're not so cool, Yeah. But it was sharp. I'm not saying, but it was interesting to see. And he's saying this at the pinnacle of the intellectual world, and people were very moved by it, actually. You could see in the audience, because he didn't mean it to berate. He was trying to communicate an idea.
Yeah. No, I completely understand why. Because there are many terms which I don't think it's properly defined. Well, there are Wikipedia definitions for these kind of things, but I don't think it's that clearly understood by everyone the same way. And those terms could be divinity, it could be transcendence, it could be the universe, it could be higher values, if you will, right? Like these are not interchangeable, with probably huge overlaps here and there. And depending on a person's, let's say, way of thinking at a moment, it could connect more to a divine and more through a religious lens. For others, it could be much more of a spiritual lens. For others, it's the something beyond us, transcendent lens. but something's got to be there as at a minimum as an idea, but even better, a belief that there is more than meets the eye, and connecting to that is a worthy endeavor, and trying to find that is a worthy endeavor, because ultimately it comes to values that define the way you're trying to. The values are more for direction, right? Like that's, I'm. Let's say you start out on a road which could go any direction whatsoever, right? There needs to be some guiding principle. That's the first one, because you can go out and when you say I feel lost, well, you feel lost because you're just wandering aimlessly around. So say, okay, how am I going to bring some consistency into the way I'm seeking a better path? Value is a good compass, and finding those right values can take you ideally to that direction. So I think there's a lot to it, because by seeking the eternal or seeking the transcendent, it inevitably lifts you up from the very visible, the very physical, the very tangible. So that's one. I don't know if you want to reflect on that before I go back to your earlier point.
I think that was very beautiful words for what we're talking about. You know, you that's beautifully articulated.
Thank you. I mean, it's kind of you to say as I'm, trying to work it out. We're all working it out. I mean, you're a little further ahead with those distilled words. The other thing that comes to mind, how interesting, because so we started with Edith Eger, who wrote the Choice, and it's not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on like in psychology, and you talked about that connection, and not just the connection, but having a home base, having a home to come back to, and it can be a physical home, a place where you grew up or something that anchors you. It can even be sort of an abstract home, your foundation,
I think it has to be both, actually, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is how interesting, like in psychology, there's the whole idea of the attachment theory, and how a baby at the beginning, but any person is attached to another person, but again, a baby to the mother, and then to other caretakers. And that attachment is just so fundamental to a person's ability to form healthy relationships later in life. And if something goes off there because of the circumstances or the mother or the baby, any millions of reasons, if that attachment is not a safe attachment, that baby is not necessarily going to grow up to be an adult who can venture far and wide, because that person doesn't know that they have a place to come back to. So it's exactly what you're saying, where you need to have that very deep, primordial level of trust that I have a place to come back to, so I can go very far away.
Absolutely.
In my life.
Beautifully put. That parallel, it's very deep between the spiritual roots and also the motherly roots and the home base, you're saying, in parenting. I think that's a very deep parallel. Absolutely.
And I'm actually curious, because I'm suspecting, and I can't wait to read the book, I'm suspecting there must be many stories or many conversations where that connection had been wounded. And through that deep wisdom and through the words could start to heal. Is there any letter or situation that comes to your mind from your book?
There's actually an elaborate story of a hostage, prisoner of war, in the war of attrition between Israel and Egypt in the 70s. He was a pilot, a very well professional private pilot. And he was taken captive into Egypt. At the time, Egypt and Israel were at loggerheads with each other. And he was there for 3 years away. He was a father of 2 young daughters, married. And he describes the mental torture of not knowing if he's there for another day or he's not there for another 40 years. He got no idea. And he comes back and he says he actually got very active in work, and everybody thought he's, look at that guy coming back swinging. What a man. But inside he felt dead. He just felt completely emotionally dead. And I think that talks a little bit to what you're saying, that something in that trust or that connection was broken by his being taken away against his will for 3 years, living in a nowhere land and just there, right? So in that case, you see the Rebbe sitting with him for 45 minutes and ask him to go through the whole story. And he describes this with very beautiful words about, he said it was the first time where he was able to revisit his experience without the fear and the shame and the guilt that used to accompany that story. Because he lost his co-pilot. It's an extensive story. It's an elaborate story. You could see it there in chapter 2. You had that stage where the Rebbe is asking him, he said he's just listening. He was just listening to him and urging him on to go through the story, the moment when his plane got shot down, the moment when he thought he was going to die, the moment when he realized he's going to live, the interrogations, the living 3 years away from his family, the coming back home. And he slowly was able to become whole by reconnecting to his own story that he said for so long his only way of dealing with was by detaching himself from it. However, at the end of their meeting, the Rebbe gave him a suggestion, and he said, I think you should write a book about your time in captivity, because unfortunately, you won't be the last hostage. There'll be, a war will continue, unfortunately, as we see it. And there'll be other people in similar situation to yours. And they will have an easier time navigating their pain if they will have read your experience. So in that way, and this Menachem reflected on afterwards, the name of the pilot, he said, he gave me purpose to my pain. He said, because I went through this, I can now help someone else to go through this in an easier way. So what I see, there's a two-phase healing. The first step is to allow him to find back that connection in a safe setting, in a secure setting, where he's just able to revisit this story without the shame and the guilt that he always felt about those years. But then step 2 doesn't just end with the connect, is to feel and find something higher, and that you can that having that experience gave you an opportunity to help others. And some letters, it's about to help yourself to connect to the divine in a new way, to reimagine your life in a new way. Sometimes deep pain is what elicits that in us. I was actually sitting in a conference of psychologists. They asked me to present on these themes from the Rebbe's psychological principles. So I was at this conference, and I was presenting on some of the therapeutic principles from the Rebbe's extensive private counseling. And one of the themes I spoke about, there was this idea of finding the purpose, but I don't like the word purpose, finding meaning in the pain and the suffering. And we were speaking about it. Different people shared their own experience with that. It was actually very special. Mental health professionals themselves were saying about their own times where they went through what seemed to be inexplicable and pointless pain. They later were able to recapture a certain meaning, a certain way of seeing how that brought them somewhere they could have never been without that. But what I want to share is a reflection from one of the psychologists in the audience that I thought really was a deep interpretation of this theme in the Rebbe's counseling. And he said, why is it so healing when we find and search out that meaning of how this brought us somewhere we would have never been able to reach had we not gone through that suffering? He said, why are painful experiences so painful? I mean, it sounds redundant, but of course there's the pain of whatever happened. If you lost a loved one, or you go through an illness, or you have a breakup, or you've frustration in a career. So that's very painful in its own right. But on top of that, there's also the deep primordial pain of losing something elemental that makes us feel whole. And that is our sense of agency, our sense of being in the driver's seat of our life. And when something that's bigger than us, that we don't have control of, unsettles and pulls out the carpet, pulls out the floor from under our lives. There's an accident, or there's something unexpected happens, or you lose someone very close to you. Together with the loss, you also, and the suffering, you also suffer because you feel robbed from your sense of agency, from your sense of empowerment. And what he was saying was, he thinks that when you do the work to find meaning in the pain, what you get back is, part of that is you're recapturing the sense of agency. You're saying, this chapter in the story of my life, I'm not going to let someone else or something else or some force of nature write it. No, I'm going to determine what it is and what it means and what its goal is. And when we do that, whether it's, in the case of the pilot, which is to say that because I went through this, I can now help someone else in the same or similar situation to go through it in an easier way, which I would have never been able to had I not had this pain. Or it can mean, maybe this allows me to reimagine my life, or to be more in touch, or to value every day in a new way. There's so many ways that pain allows us to grow in deep ways. But when we seek that out and we find that, not only are we better people, we also can heal, because we recapture that sense of agency. Say, I'm going to write every part of my life. I am driving this, and I am determining what this means and what this brings me. And it's not just happening on me or being acted on me. I am acting as a part of it and choosing what its meaning is. So that was a very deep insight, I thought. That's part of kind of refinding the connection and refinding the sense of agency when we lose that connection, or something in someone else or a force of nature, seemingly robs us of it, or, another army robs us of it. And we find that, and we heal, we connect to our story, and we also connect to our sense of agency and direction. So that's a response to that.
Really, really, really very deep, very true, and very useful. Because somebody who's gone through adversity, and show me one person who has not, will connect with that idea, and not so much, because when you tell someone who's currently in pain or currently at a very difficult place in their life, and you say, well, there's going to be meaning in it, well, they would cynically just, wish you hadn't said anything of that sort. But hopefully one day when they're over that and they've managed to come out of it, partly thanks to books like yours and partly thanks to those methods and wisdom, they realize that I've come out on the sunny side of that tunnel, and I've come to a place where I understand and I can connect. And most importantly, indeed, when you say, okay, this has taught me something. This has given me something. This has helped me grow as a person, and I can connect with others in similar situation, and perhaps I can help them more than I could be helped at the time. That gives a very deep sense of meaning. And I'm reminded, there's the book on, it's a famous piece in psychology, the 5 stages of grief. So when you're grieving, there are 5 stages, and the author who was a co-author of the original piece, he wrote a follow-up many years after, because he lost his son to suicide, and it was a very, very, very difficult thing. And so someone who writes about grief, having to go through that ultimate grief of all, he wrote that book, which is the 6th stage of grief, which is finding meaning. Exactly like you say, where he's been able to process it to the degree that's possible to process, and distill the insight from it, and saying, where I understand what the meaning of this is, that gives me perhaps a little bit of agency back over my life, and I can at least help others in such difficult situations.
Yes, absolutely. That's very interesting. I'll check out that book, actually. So yeah. It's called The 6th Stage of Grief.
The sixth stage of grief, I think. Or maybe that's a subtitle, but I think finding meaning or something along those lines. So with those ideas, and I'm very grateful that we could organize this before you have an event coming up. So Letters for Life, I love the title. That's a very, very nice one, and can't wait to read this. And especially, I think the true genius, the true wisdom, the true depth is where you not only know this as an idea, this meaning how to come to an emotional wellness or how to aim for emotional wellness. And it's not just that you're able to connect with another person, but you can apply it at such depth that it's immediately, it resonates with them, and they can turn their life around for the better.
Yes. Yes, I wish that on all of us, that we should be able to take in these type of wisdom in a way that touches us. At the end of the day, we have to open our minds. If we shut the door, then it can't come in. So,
Levi, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our little ritual with our cards. So I'll ask you to pull a card and answer it. Can you read it out?
What have you learned from two people you've gone out with? I met one person who I've been floored by their sense of direction, like their commitment to a certain ideal, and they're being unwavering about it. That was just recently. I met someone a few days ago who told me that it's connected to what we're talking about, her son, 15-year-old son, committed suicide. And she was very close with her son, and she came to her as a total surprise. And of course, there's the guilt, and there's the remorse, and there's obviously the loss. But she was telling me how she found in herself strength to realize that her son is still with her in a certain way, and they're still connected. And that to let go of the sense of saying it was all my fault, and to try to connect with her son, and do things for him. And that was very, very powerful for me. And actually, as I'm saying this, I'm reminding myself of someone else that I met, her husband was a healthy guy. And she told me that 6 months earlier, it was his birthday, actually, and he went on a hike. Very strong person. And something with his heart failed. And she said he came home. He said it wasn't feeling good. He went to bed. He said 20 minutes later, I was doing CPR on him, and there was no one to resuscitate. It's a guy she lived with from her 20s. She's now in her 60s. I was like, but she said how she has been working to be the hands and legs of her husband. And she feels that it's upon her to continue her husband's life, and she feels that her husband is his spirit is still with her in a certain way. And the reason why I'm repeating all this is because I actually knew a few people that were murdered on October 7th, and there's a letter that's not in the book, but that resurfaced in my brain after that, where the Rebbe writes to a young man going through different darkness. And he says that after the Holocaust, this is a letter from the 60s, after the Holocaust, we don't just live for ourselves. There were so many young people whose lives were cut short. And when we live, we have a duty to live not only for ourselves, but also to live their life and to extend their life by living our lives, by choosing to live and by living it to the utmost. We have a duty, to them, to not succumb to the emotional darkness and pain, but to live and live even stronger. And I think after tragedies like this war, there's so many young people being lost, and the sense of duty that we have is not just a moral thing. It's also actually, in a interesting way, gives us emotional strength, and it's a way to transcend, because we know that there's a reason. And we have a responsibility and a role here to continue the lives of all those that have been lost. So there was 2 people that I met over the last few months that have reinforced that in a very special way from a very personal space. So that's 2 people that I've met lately that have really touched me.
So much appreciate you sharing that, and the whole idea of purpose and hope and looking forward despite all the adversity, but looking to get to a better, broader, higher place.
That's an amazing way to sum it up. Thank you so much, Andras. Wow.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And hopefully wishing you lots of success with the book, and recommend it to everyone to read it, myself being the first one when I get home. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.